Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. It's my first time in Portland, coming in from Vancouver, Canada. First time here, and it's really special to be here for the first ever Bitcoin is for Everyone conference. I'm here to speak on behalf of the Human Rights Foundation, or HRF for short. And I can only imagine that for some of you, the question on your mind is, why on earth is a Human Rights Foundation presenting at a Bitcoin conference? So today, that's what I hope to answer, is to just show you why human rights and Bitcoin are interlinked together and why that link is super, super important. My name is Ayelen Osorio, and you can think of the word violin without the V to remember the name. And I work at the Human Rights Foundation, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that promotes and protects the human rights around the world with a really special focus on closed societies. So that would be sort of authoritarian regimes and dictatorships around the world. We have different tracks and programs, with one of them being the Financial Freedom Program. And that's where I sit leading content and research. And I thought that to explain what our program does, I would just go ahead and read our mission statement. So if you could just follow along here. It goes like this: HRF's Financial Freedom Program exists to highlight how authoritarian regimes engage in financial repression to crack down on dissent and opposition, and to support individuals pushing back through the use of open source Bitcoin software. So from here, what I'd like to do is to show you how these authoritarian regimes are financially repressing activists, journalists, lawyers, human rights defenders, and civil society organizations, but really going ahead and financially repressing a lot of the population. So I'll start here with Russia on the left-hand side for you. The gentleman on the blue t-shirt was Alexei Navalny, who was Russia's biggest opposition. And he spent a lot of his time really challenging Vladimir Putin's regime, as well as revealing the sort of corruption that was happening with state companies and senior government officials in Russia. And he also started the Anti-Corruption Foundation, I think it was back in 2011. And for his work, he often got his bank account blocked off. It wasn't just his bank account that got blocked off. It was also the bank account of the people that were working for him in the Anti-Corruption Foundation, or ACF. So for example, the lady with the red sweater next to him is I won't try to say her name because it's a bit difficult, but she's a local legislator in Tomsk, Siberia, who was leading a branch of the Anti-Corruption Foundation. And just for leading that branch, she was labeled an extremist and then sentenced to 9 years in prison. And that doesn't stop there, because really, anyone that's around activists, that could be their family members as well, they also face a level of financial repression. 6 months after that, I think it was about 6 months, but earlier this year, Alexei Navalny was then murdered while serving an unlawful 19-year sentence at a penal colony in Russia. Then here in the middle side, we have the Philippines. The Anti-Money Laundering Council froze the assets and the bank accounts of indigenous rights activists. And kind of following in the same footprints as Russia, it labeled these activists as extremists, which then gave them the power to go in and block their bank accounts. And again, blocking the bank accounts didn't stop with the activists. It went also to their family members, so their spouses, and it also went to anybody that would be helping or collaborating or working with these activists. So as an example, if you were a lawyer that wanted to help this activist, then you also saw your bank account frozen. Or if you were a vendor trying to do business with these activists, you also got your bank account frozen. And then here we have, on the right-hand side, we have an example of a journalist called Ihar Karnay in Belarus. So he got imprisoned because he was, quote-unquote, publishing material that was insulting the head of state being authoritarian President Alexander Lukashenko. And the thing is that journalists are really important, because if they do their work well, they're holding these powers to account. They're revealing a lot of the truth that's going on about the financial and political affairs in the country, which empowers civilians to be able to vote or do their best in voting and deciding what they want to see in their countries. And by imprisoning him, what Lukashenko is doing is keeping Belarusians in the dark. And what he's doing while he's doing that is working to streamline the banking system in the country. So streamlining it really to make it transparent and obedient to his dictatorship, while also at the same time pushing forward with a central bank digital currency, which I'm going to get to later on. But for those that don't know much about it, it's a new type of digital currency that at the Human Rights Foundation we're very concerned about, as we see them violating people's human rights and freedoms. So financial repression in these dictatorships isn't just happening in Russia, in the Philippines, and Belarus. We're seeing that all over the world. In China, for example, the regime is using facial recognition to try and scout throughout the country activists and dissidents on the streets, and then finding them, cutting their bank accounts or imprisoning them. In Pakistan as well, we're seeing activists and journalists or even media organizations that are speaking up against the regime. They are getting their payments withheld, or they're getting their payments delayed or completely frozen. And what that's doing in the country is forcing these activists to face financial hardship, self-censor, and a new trend that's been happening recently is that they're just leaving the country. So when you have these freedom fighters leaving the countries, it's sort of like they've given up a little bit. There's almost like no hope, and it leaves a dictator in complete sort of full reign to continue to oppress other populations. So to summarize sort of the problems we're seeing in dictatorships is that if a dictator doesn't like you, and again, who they don't like is activists, dissidents, journalists, lawyers, etc., dictators will freeze the money of those people. They will debank them, confiscate their assets, sometimes even passing laws to allow authorities to confiscate those assets, as is the case in Russia. And financial surveillance, and just like seeing everybody's sort of, who you're sending money to, who you're receiving money from, and then just punishing you for that. So at the HRF, we believe that everyone, activists, and even just general civilians, should have access to a form of money that does not get surveilled, that doesn't get manipulated, controlled, or confiscated from them. And this is where we see Bitcoin entering into play. Now, before I explain why we think Bitcoin helps, I want to share with you some inspiring stories of activists that have faced financial repression and then are fighting back with Bitcoin. So I'll start with Roya Mahboub. If you've been in the Bitcoin space, I think you've probably heard her story. I had the privilege of meeting her a few months ago and just get to know her. She's incredible, and get to hear her story from her point of view. She is from Afghanistan. She is the first female tech CEO, and back in 2011, she founded the Women's Annex. So it was a sort of like a media company, and hired women to write articles, to publish blog posts, to work for her. But of course, she came across some problems hiring women. And here's the thing that she said is that women in Afghanistan are legally allowed to have bank accounts once they turn 18, but they need the permission of a male relative. So that male relative could be a father, it could be a cousin, a brother, etc. But oftentimes those male relatives won't allow them to have bank accounts because they want to control the money. And so when Roya hired these women to come on, she had two options to pay them. She said she could either give them a lot of cash, but that was really risky. Because if you're a woman in Afghanistan and you're walking down the streets with a lot of cash, that puts you at high risk of violence and, as she says, kidnapping. The other option she had was to pay the male relatives the salary of the woman, which I think is where she leaned more towards. The problem was then that she would soon get complaints from her women's staff saying, hey, you haven't paid me. But Roya would say, yes, I did. And it turns out that the male relatives were receiving the money, but they're not paying any of it out to the woman. So Roya was trying to figure out, well, how can we fix this? I know there's this idea of digital money. I think it's working in Kenya, so she looked into that. But obviously, whatever financial systems they had in Kenya wouldn't apply over to Afghanistan. And then in her rabbit hole, she found Bitcoin, started learning about it. And like any sane person, she was at first skeptical, but continued down her rabbit hole research, and then started teaching the women about Bitcoin and educating them, and went as far as to build a Bitcoin wallet that would plug into her payment system. So she told women, her staff, about Bitcoin, how it could work, that she could pay them directly into their Bitcoin wallets. And she says, in her words, that the women were so excited for having the opportunity to have their own money and to have it so quickly and right away in their full ownership. So there's this beautiful quote that Roya always says, which is that Bitcoin allows women in Afghanistan to bypass the social and physical barriers to money. I just love that story so much. Next up, we have Anna Chekovich, who is from Russia. I mentioned earlier that Alexei Navalny founded the Anti-Corruption Foundation, ACF. She works for the foundation as a chief financial officer. And I also got to meet her a few months ago. And she says that one day she went into work, opened up her laptop, logged into her bank account like any other day, and noticed that the bank account said minus 1 trillion Russian rubles, which at the time was equivalent to 13 billion euros. She says, I almost fainted. I almost screamed, like she could not believe what she was seeing. And it was especially stressful because she had to pay the salaries of 300 employees, and she had to pay the rent for 40 offices across Russia, and also fund the activists and political prisoners, and of course, pay the day-to-day operations of the foundation. So she calls up the bank, and the bank says, yeah, there's nothing we can do. There's a criminal case against you. We got that call yesterday, and we were forced to shut down your bank account. And that's when she realized that simply because she was working at ACF, she was now labeled an extremist. Now there was a fabricated criminal case against her, and that allowed the governments to go into the bank and say, cut their bank account right away. What they were forced to do was then to go and open a new legal entity in order to be able to create a new bank account, only to see that shut down, and then again open up a new legal entity, open a new bank account, and try and work. And as you can imagine, an organization that is spending all of their time trying to restart really slows down their work, especially if they're a democratic movement. It really stops their work or any progress that they're trying to achieve. Again, like Roya, she looked for alternatives, found Bitcoin, and then started using it. And she said that it was very helpful to have Bitcoin because as the Russian regime was shutting down their bank account, she was getting into Bitcoin, and every time the bank account was shut down, she would just pay the employees in Bitcoin and pay the rent in Bitcoin as well. So she was no longer being so affected by the shutdowns of her bank accounts. So, and it also had another effect, which was pretty, I think, remarkable, is that if you are in Russia, you're Russian, and you donate money to the ACF, who is trying to fight Vladimir Putin, you will go to prison. Same if you are a vendor or a merchant that is receiving money from the ACF, you will also go to prison. When they started getting into Bitcoin, then Russians that knew about Bitcoin started donating Bitcoin to ACF to support their efforts. And they knew that they wouldn't, if they did it well, they wouldn't be put in prison, which then kind of encouraged ACF to educate Russians about Bitcoin so that if they want to support ACF, they can do that through Bitcoin. And now they're really heavily reliant on using Bitcoin or receiving donations, making payments in Bitcoin, and they even paid for Alexei Navalny's funeral in Bitcoin as well. So one thing that really stuck with me when I met with her was her saying, I don't know what we would have done without Bitcoin. Lastly, we have Win Koko Ang. He is from Burma. You might know Burma as Myanmar. So Burma is the original name until the dictatorship took over and renamed the country Myanmar. In 2021, there was a military coup that overthrew the democratically elected government. Win spoke out against that and saying this wasn't fair, this wasn't democratic, and really encouraged the youth to stand up against that. And because of that, he became a target. He says he woke up one day, turned the TV on, as he normally did, and then in national television was a wanted list. And in that wanted list was his name with his photo, his home address, and more personal information. And so he says he had two options then, is either stay in Burma and face the repercussions of that, or escape. And as he's escaping, trying to figure out how he's going to go into exile, then he realizes, of course, his bank account is also shut down. He has no money to leave. He decides to leave Burma regardless, then makes a 10-hour trek across the jungle into Thailand and was able to survive with his Bitcoin. So he was able to cross borders with Bitcoin and survive there for a few months while he tried to seek asylum in the United States. And he's been here now for, I believe, a couple of years. So for him, Bitcoin is the biggest technology revolution that there is, and he's a big proponent of it. And fun fact, both Anna and Win now work at the Human Rights Foundation, so it's a huge honor to be working with such like incredible people. I'm learning a lot about that as well, so it's been awesome. So to summarize, what Bitcoin is doing for activists, and really I know the title is activist, but I want to say what it's doing for the general population, is that it's giving people financial freedom. And at HRF, we define financial freedom as the ability to earn, to save, and transact without fear of censorship or confiscation. And that's what Bitcoin is doing. And it's doing that through a variety of different ways, mainly because it's decentralized. And what that means is that there is a global network of computers around the world it's operated by a global network of computers around the world versus a centralized bank or centralized government. Anybody anywhere in the world can participate to help run it, or they can just engage with it, which is very helpful because if you're an activist in Russia, then you can receive donations from somebody in the US pretty quickly and at very minimal fees. And because of its decentralized nature, it's censorship resistant. So if you have Bitcoin, a dictator can't just shut down or confiscate your Bitcoin away from you. So that's really, really powerful for activists because it allows them to just continue their work, even if their traditional bank accounts are shut down. It also provides privacy and anonymity, because if you have a Bitcoin wallet, it's not inherently tied to your name and personal information if you're careful with it. So it adds that layer of protection for activists, which is really important, especially if they're in surveillance and authoritarian regimes. It also provides store of value because it has a limited supply of 21 million. And this has actually been an interesting sort of realm for me as I've joined HRF, is realizing that there is sort of like a correlation between dictatorships and poverty. That dictators obviously take over the judicial system, they take over the media networks, they absorb all the resources, and then they devalue the currency in order to fund their wars and their operations. And so it makes it really difficult for activists to be able to operate in these weak and failing economies. But if they're on Bitcoin, they're able to have some sort of money that no one can take away from them and that will theoretically hold value over the long term, which helps them think of their movements in the long term versus being on a survival mode all the time. So all of this helps to bring financial freedom to activists and to continue to fight for freedom under tyranny. So I've been at HRF for about 6 months now. It feels a lot longer. But one of the things that we've been working on is the creation of a financial freedom report. And this is a weekly newsletter that goes out every Thursday. And there's a QR code and the link if you're interested, and a glimpse of the newsletter. But what we do there is we cover news of financial repression worldwide. So that's the first half of the newsletter. The second half is then showcasing how Bitcoin is helping activists and people and helping them protect their financial freedom. It's been really, really interesting. And in this research, what I've been learning as well is the government reaction to so much Bitcoin adoption that's happening in silence. So I'm going to share a little bit about that. And that it is that they're getting scared, and they're creating their own digital currencies, and they're marketing it like Bitcoin, and they're saying, these digital currencies called Central Bank Digital Currencies, they're going to help with financial inclusion, they're going to bank the unbanked, it's going to be great, it'll be really fast, except that what they're not saying is that it's going to be heavily programmable by central banks and governments, which we see as a big risk to people's freedoms around the world. What these risks are is that, and I've just named a few of them, there's probably a lot more, but it will allow governments, and especially like dictators, to easily set holding limits. So they'll be able to say, you can only have $10,000 in your account, everything that is surplus you must spend or you lose. They'll be able to more easily freeze and seize the assets. They won't need to go through a chain of people to cut down someone's bank account. They can do it themselves because they've got easier access to that. They can also automate fine deductions, and this is pretty crazy. I think it was back in March, Iran passed a law that allows authorities to take money away from the bank accounts of women who violate the hijab law. So if you're a woman, you're in the streets, and you're not wearing the hijab, or perhaps you're wearing it a bit wrong, it's a bit off, then authorities can go into your bank account without letting you know, without your permission, and take money away. So that's already happening at the legacy financial system, but with CBDCs, it's going to be able to happen much more quickly and at larger scale. It also will be able to control purchases say you can only buy in these stores but not others, set spending and expiry dates, and apply location-based restrictions. And this is already happening because I believe it was last month in April, Thailand rolled out CBDCs to the countries, to about 50 million people, and it came with rules. So it said, you get these CBDCs, but you can only spend it in your neighborhood, and you can only spend it at stores that are part of our program that we have vetted and approved. And your money expires in 6 months. So you can start to see how this starts to get very, very dangerous in the wrong hands, especially in dictatorships, because the majority of the world right now lives under a dictatorship. It's very, very terrifying. And lastly, it might be able to help banks and governments create individual customization. And I try to think about this. An example that I can think of is in China, there is a genocide happening against the Uyghur population. The Uyghur population are Turkish descent, they're Muslim, but also Chinese. The government doesn't really like them because they're constantly opposing the existing regime. And so how this might play out is that if you're in mainland China, you get a bunch of functionality in your bank account. But if you're a minority group, like the Uyghur people, then you get very basic banking. So your financial freedoms are really limited. And this can expand to be other types of minority groups, whether that be religious, ethnic, maybe you're gay, so in Russia, so now you don't get full functionality with your banking account. So we see this as a really, really big risk to our financial freedoms in the long run. So this is actually interesting. I wasn't at HRF when this happened, but they partnered with researchers last year and spent 10 months trying to figure out where are governments at with CBDCs. Who's researching, who's piloting, who's deploying them, and how is this affecting activists as well. And I shared 2 of the key findings here. But there were many more, and I don't think I have too much time to go over them. But what we found was that there is a global trend, that the majority of the world's government, 62% of them, are actively researching, building, or deploying CBDCs. And this is happening without public awareness, without any media coverage, and this is also happening without governments even asking people what they want out of their digital money, or even if they should move forward with this digital money. So they're working on this behind the scenes until, what I suspect, when they're ready, they will pull the curtain, and then you were forced into CBDCs. And we also, not surprisingly, found out that authoritarians are leading the way. Dictatorships are leading the charge in CBDC deployment. HRF estimates that 3.7 billion people, or 46% of the world population. It is actually now more because now India has moved from democracy to authoritarianism. So I think that number is closer to 5.7 billion, which might be 72% of the world's population are now living under authoritarianism. And so they're living under autocracies, under these dictators that are experimenting heavily with CBDCs. And what's really, really interesting is that I think some people will walk into CBDCs blindly, but there's also a lot of pushback happening. So China is actually leading the charge with CBDCs. And here, this was, I think, from last week, has been paying their Chinese workers in CBDCs. And what's fascinating is that these Chinese workers are they're receiving their CBDCs, and they're immediately cashing out. They don't want to be in a centralized and surveilling currency. And what they're also doing is then meeting up in coffee shops and laundromats, wherever they can, to buy Bitcoin, to trade Bitcoin, to get cash. And so it's really, really interesting to see that as governments push this type of currency, that people still want freedom, and they're finding that freedom in Bitcoin. So that's pretty much what I have right now for the presentation. I hope I haven't depressed you guys too much. But it is heavy stuff, especially working at HRF. It can get a bit sort of daunting and depressing when there's so much going on behind the scenes, and you feel like you're the only one talking about it because the New York Times isn't going to put CBDCs or financial repression up on the cover page. But that's what we're doing through the newsletter, is really trying to bring awareness into the role of money and how they hurt our freedoms. And especially when you have activists and freedom fighters that want to combat tyranny, want to bring freedom to their people, how they're the ones that are the first to suffer and suffer the most. So at HRF, we continue our work in educating activists and hopefully the general population about Bitcoin as a way out of surveillance money. We do education, we do hands-on training, so we'll actually go in and meet in person with activists and journalists and freedom fighters in person and tell them, okay, well, this is how Bitcoin works, this is how you can be private with it, this is how you can receive donations securely. But we don't advertise that because that would put them at risk, but know that that's something that we do. And we also give global grants to the Bitcoin space. So if there's builders, developers, entrepreneurs, activists, educators, creative people that are working to help make Bitcoin a robust and global financial system for not just activists, but for the people, and especially under dictatorships, we fund their work and we help support them because we think that this is a great thing for the world. It's freedom money. So thank you so much for your time. If you would like to get in touch, I have put my email address there. It's Ayelen, AYELEN @hrf.org. I also invite you to subscribe to the newsletter if you're interested in it. There's a link and also the QR code. These go out every day Thursday. So if you do read them, please reply and let me know your thoughts because I read all those emails. Yeah, and thank you so much.
Round of applause for Ayelen, please.
Thank you for having me.
My question's more on the custody side. Self-custody, I imagine, is a massive aspect to any of these individuals that are trying to fight back. I'd be curious how you and your team approach that from an education standpoint and even, a recommendation standpoint in terms of recommending to use a Lightning wallet versus maybe holding Bitcoin on the main chain and using hardware wallets.
Thank you for that. So when we do these hands-on training, they're led by another team member. So I haven't been privy to those private training sessions, but it is something that I want to get into, and I've asked if I could participate in them. And we also have another branch at HRF called Freedom Fellows, and that's where we take activists from around the world and we give them a whole set of digital toolkits. So that could be, how do you storytell? Here's some counseling. How do you protect yourself? Digital privacy, and now we've added Bitcoin as well. So I've also asked to be a part of that and to see how, what are we telling them when it comes to self-custody? What are the tools that we're recommending? So I don't have a specific answer for that just yet, but that is also something that we start to talk about in the newsletter, is if there's any major update in the Bitcoin space, and especially if it relates to privacy, so whether that's a BIP or a community event or a wallet, then we'll add that in. But we're not really, from what I understand so far, attached to a specific wallet. We're always looking at, what are the best tools out there, and we're always looking what's the weakness. And we actually have now Anna Czekovic from the Anti-Corruption Foundation, who's joined HRF, and what she's going to be doing is teaching nonprofit organizations how to get into Bitcoin and how to self-custody, because she has had that experience where she's had to be very careful and be very private with her Bitcoin donations. But she's been with us for like a month or maybe two, so she's still figuring all of that out. But I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of that new branch and program. Yeah, I can follow up with you if you want with specific answers, but yeah, it's a great question.
What type of precautions do we need to keep in working with the HRF in order to make sure we're protected and our freedom to speak out for either medical tyranny or various other activism that we do?
Yeah, it's a great question. So HRF, within our mission is we do focus on authoritarian regimes, so not so much democratic countries. That said, we still try and help activists in democracies. If you're curious to get some help, I could put you in touch with Anna, who is starting that whole branch within the financial freedom team. And just to keep you in mind, like the financial freedom team is the newest team at HRF. It's a new branch that we're exploring and working with to try and get financial freedom around the world. But what she's been doing since starting is doing a quarterly webinar now, a series. So it's a whole week-long webinar series where nonprofits, activists come on, and they every day get training on, okay, well, what is Bitcoin? How do you use it privately? All of that. How do you incorporate it into your organization? So that might be helpful for you to come on and to then ask her your questions yourself, especially because she has so much expertise in that space. I think it'll be very, very valuable. And so if you can come and find me later, then I'd love to put you in touch with her. And it'll be helpful for us as well. And especially for me as I lead content and research, is to find those stories and to see how is Bitcoin helping activists and then telling them to the rest of the world. So happy to put you in touch with Anna. I think you will actually really, really enjoy working with her.
Ayelen, I'm curious, Do you think Bitcoin is a human right?
Yes, but I kind of worry that it won't get to everyone. Just to give a bit of context, I'm from Venezuela and Bolivia, and I'm probably the first person in my family, one of the first people in my family to go to university and to come to North America and speak English. I'm very, very privileged, and my family is very hardworking. And we come from Venezuela and Bolivia, two of the harshest dictatorships in South America, which has forced my family to leave and work really hard. And sometimes I hear this idea that, oh, people in the global south, they hear Bitcoin and they just get it. And sometimes I worry that that's not true, because when I look at my family as immigrants and hardworking people, they work 18 hours a day, 20 hours a day. They don't have time for Bitcoin. And as much as Bitcoin, I believe it is a human right, it should be a human right, I worry that time and energy is something that the rest of the world don't have, but we do. And one thing I always say is if we're bored with our lives, then that's a luxury that we have. If we can afford to go and learn about Bitcoin, that's a great luxury. So again, while it's a huge human right, and I'm a big passionate of it as an enabler of human rights around the world, I worry that the people that need it the most don't always have the time and resources to learn it, but which is why it's important for us and all of you, if you believe in this as well, to help uplift someone alongside with you.
I know that you've said that you've been at the HRF for just a short amount of time, but in your time there so far, I guess what has been your favorite story that you've heard, or what country have you learned about where Bitcoin has made the most effective change so far against financial repression?
Oh my gosh. What I'm finding is that the countries where financial repression happens a lot is also the country that tends to have, from my research, the biggest not the biggest, but the most communities, the most educational communities, which I love. And what I'm seeing is also that these communities are working really hard to get Bitcoin content translated into their languages. And so at HRF, when we give global grants, we're also giving global grants to local initiatives. So if, for example, in Russia, in Pakistan, which is very much needed because I think a lot of the Bitcoin content right now is in English. A lot of the wallets are in English. All the hardware, everything is in English. And people that are in the harshest of dictatorships, I think the first thing they're tackling is education and turning all of that content into the local languages. That's kind of what I'm seeing. What makes me hopeful, because every time I have to write a really depressing story on the newsletter, then I'll go in and say, but there's this community, this group of people, this group of women that are turning this education into their local languages to help other people, because I think that's how we're going to get a lot of adoption. Is this needs to be turned into, it's global money, but it also needs to have a global set of education. But yeah, every week I kind of, when I'm sourcing through stories for the global news section, I'm like, man, this world is so dark. The future looks pretty just grim, but then I have to then fill out the second half, which is the Bitcoin news, and that's where I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so awesome to see so many developers just be so innovative and push the edges of that innovation, and to have these activists daring, because it is really scary if you're an activist and you believe in Bitcoin to talk about it in a dictatorship. That's talking about Bitcoin in a dictatorship that has banned Bitcoin. You're putting your life at risk, and yet they still do it, and yet they find ways to onboard other people onto Bitcoin, and I think then that just gives me that rush of hope, and I'm just like, yes, keep innovating, keep building, keep pushing, because that's really an escape that we all need. So I go through these two emotions every week.
Financial engineering, if you will, freezing of assets, things that you talk about that are important. That's a tool that's used by these organizations, but there's also more nefarious groups out there, terrorist organizations, warlords, those that are involved with, very unscrupulous issues out there. And how do you keep the good and also filter out the bad with Bitcoin?
Yeah, a great question. And you kind of, because if it's going to be money for everyone, then it has to be money for everyone. You can't start to make rules, because then that's when you start to get into dangerous territory. You can't say, especially with dictators, because their decision making is so arbitrary. Like who is bad and who is good changes by the day. It changes all the time. So if you start to say that Bitcoin should not be allowed for criminals, well, in people that live in dictatorships, most of them are criminals. The good people are the criminals. And so you cannot say that Bitcoin shouldn't be allowed for criminals, because the word criminal and how we define that is subjective around the world. And so you have to allow it to be for everyone. And unfortunately, that means, maybe groups like Hamas or other terrorist organizations as well, which I would love to hope that is really a minority of the users. I don't think I mean, based on no research, but I don't think that there would be a lot of them that would be on Bitcoin, and probably it would get them into trouble to use Bitcoin because, it would find them out pretty easily if they're not being careful. But I sort of, again, have to focus my energy on, okay, this is helping the people that need helping. And it's like I said, like majority of the world are very financially repressed. So I'm going with that. That's what I tell myself, and that's how I reconcile it. It's just like, it's helping the people that need it the most. So yeah, it's not perfect. But again, crime is very subjective in the global south under dictatorship. So yeah, I'm for Bitcoin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ayelen. Round of applause, please.
Thank you, guys.